Desiccated grama grass wilting on the ground. Crisp yellow leaves are falling all around. A west wind blows with cruel might, and the prairie fires burn all through the night. We need rain. We need rain. Not a cloud in the sky, in the pale blue sky. If we don't get a rain, everything's gonna die.
Well, good evening, K-Squid listeners, and a very happy spring to you. It's every other Sunday again. I'm Ronnie Lipschitz, and you're listening to Sustainability Now, a bi-weekly K-Squid radio show focused on environment, sustainability, and social justice in the Monterey Bay region, California, and the world. Tonight, it's California water. According to the U.S. Drought Monitor, virtually all of California is abnormally dry or worse. And we're being told that the western United States is experiencing a mega drought. The Sierra snowpack is meager, and contracted water supplies through the state's delivery systems are likely to be much less than requested. Farmers and cities are looking to groundwater to make up the difference, but even groundwater is heavily depleted. My guest today on Sustainability Now is Dr. Ruth Langridge, UCSC researcher on groundwater and instructor in legal studies. Dr. Langridge did her graduate work at UC Berkeley in environmental science, policy, and management, and has been affiliated with UCSC since at least 2003. She's conducted research on California groundwater and climate change since 2001 with support from state and federal grants, and she's been an advisor to various state agencies too. It would not be incorrect, I think, to say that she is one of the country's premier experts on groundwater. So, Ruth Langridge, welcome to Sustainability Now.
Thank you.
So, Ruth,
that's a nice introduction.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, we've known each other for quite a long time, and I seem to recall that when you first arrived at UCSC, water was not on your agenda, or maybe I'm recalling incorrectly. But what did you study at UC Berkeley, and how did you get into the water business?
Well, I'm going to start even further back than that, because for a big chunk of my adult life, I was actually a choreographer and dancer, and right. I became interested in environmental issues, and then I decided to go back to school, and I went for a master's degree at Oregon State University, where it seemed clear that the place to focus would be on forests, because that was a major resource. And then when I returned to California for my PhD at Berkeley, I actually saw water as the central natural resource issue for the state. And so I did actually shift my focus at that time. I had read Joe Sachs's article, a very prominent water lawyer, and was very excited to see that he taught water law at Berkeley, and thrilled that he became a member of my dissertation committee and was a mentor both during that time and afterward. And my thesis really focused then on surface water. It looked at a legal and institutional history of an interbasin diversion of water in California from the Eel River into the Russian River, which are northern California rivers, via a small hydropower project. And I was interested in why certain claims were initially prioritized and why that changed over time. And then eventually I shifted to groundwater.
Okay, so I remembered incorrectly. Well, we've had a pretty dry winter, and we're starting to hear the usual warnings about drought and such. And I'm sure many of our listeners are well versed in California water, but you mentioned interbasin transfers, and one of the big parts of California water is that it gets moved around a lot. So maybe we can start with the state's water infrastructure, and where the water is, and who owns it, and who gets it, and why.
Okay. Where is it? So I think really the most important thing is to think about both climate and geography together to really understand how the water infrastructure has developed. So we have dry summers, which means somehow we have to find water in the summertime because it's not going to come from precipitation. Periodic droughts are the norm, going way, way back. You can see, graphs that show you these various droughts that we've had throughout the past, really, 2 centuries. And also there are really big differences spatially in precipitation. So there's more rain in the north and less in the south. So actually a lot of our precipitation is in the watersheds north of Sacramento, and yet a lot of our development is in the southern Central Valley and, of course, the huge metropolises down in Southern California. So there's somewhat of a disconnect between where the water is and where the development is in the state. And I thought about what you just said, where is it, who owns it, who gets it, and why. So I thought maybe I would just say something about who owns it, because sometimes there's a little misconception about that. So historically, water belongs to the people of the United States, and the states are actually in charge of allocation and use and management of private rights to water. So they're the ones who kind of allocate the water out. It's also enshrined in our California Constitution that the state's water belongs to all the people of the state. And also importantly, you never get a right to a piece of water. You only get a right to use water. And that right to use water comes with a lot of what I would think of as public interest responsibilities and limitations. So water has this interesting public-private aspect to it. So in our California state, you have to maximize what they call beneficial uses, and the state has a whole process for defining what those are, like agriculture. It could mean ecosystem services. It could mean municipal development. And also at the turn of the 20th century, we passed, we amended our Constitution to say that water had to be conserved and not wasted in particular, and that water use had to be reasonable. So those are some constraints on the private rights to water, and there are also federal statutes like the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act that place limits on it. And so now thinking about that, who gets it and why, so that there's a legal system that evolved in California that determines who gets it, and it really began when we didn't know very much about the connection between surface and groundwater. So both surface water and groundwater have two different legal systems that they go under, and I don't know if you really want me to go into all of that, but surface water basically, the thing to remember about surface water is that essentially since 1914, you had to get a permit to take your surface water. If you were somebody who was going to divert it out of a stream, if you were land-based and you actually lived on the stream, you didn't need a permit. You had what's called a riparian right. But for groundwater, there was never any need to get a right from the state for a very, very long time. You could just pump water right over, if you were an overlying lander, you would just put in your well and you would pump water out of it. And it was, essentially our Southern California, if you look at the early history of Los Angeles and that area, it was all built on groundwater because we didn't have any real way of getting major amounts of surface water down there. There are some rules that govern groundwater that basically prioritize people who own land over a groundwater basin, and they can pump almost as much as they want, with some minor restrictions. And again, some of the reasonable use restrictions. And then municipalities generally have junior rights, and because they have to somehow get that water and bring it over to the cities. And so that's who gets it and why. And eventually what happened was, I guess I should add one other thing there. I don't know if you want to jump in at this point.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Go ahead.
Pardon?
Go ahead with what you were saying.
Oh, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of water use varying quite dramatically across regions between wet and dry years. So an average amount of water in terms of what we actually consume isn't terribly meaningful, but it's good to know that agriculture basically consumes significantly more than urban uses. And those, because of wet and dry years, it's hard to really put a number on that during the 2012 to 2016 major drought that we had, there were restrictions placed just on primarily on urban water use, pretty limited on agriculture. They were lifted, and many agencies went back to a lot of the old ways of using water. But then eventually in 2018, laws were passed that are now going to set stronger standards and targets for how much water can be used, with the goal of 55 gallons a day per person up to about 2025, and then eventually down to even 50 gallons a person, which is pretty low because the average consumption is closer to about 80 to 100 gallons per day for indoor use. So, we'll have a lot of conserving to do there.
So I know Santa Cruz. I know that in Santa Cruz we're down near the bottom in terms of
yes,
how much
Santa
we use.
Cruz is pretty impressive. They have been a very strong water conservation area and city.
But of course, we don't get our water from the state systems, right? It's all local.
Yes, Santa Cruz is interesting because unlike a lot of the coastal areas which do rely on groundwater, Santa Cruz relies primarily on surface water. So actually, its biggest issue in Santa Cruz is what happens when there's a drought and there's not enough surface water.
Yeah. Well, maybe just one more thing, and that has to do with the two big water systems that deliver water from the north to the south. Can you say a few words about why those were built, and what they do, why they were built?
Absolutely, yeah, because that really does define so much of the water in our state. And again, I'm just going to go back to this idea that we have dry summers, we have periodic droughts, and we have more rain in the north and less in the south. So already you see that there are going to be some problems in places in the south in particular, but we're also going to be concerned about drought, and we're going to be concerned seasonally. And the seasonal solution was to pump groundwater. But I'm going to also mention one other really important thing, which is that we realized that a lot of our water storage is in snow up in the mountains in the Sierras and even in the Cascades. And that snow melts and runs off in the spring. So there was an early push to try to capture some of that water in reservoirs, surface water, although it does also percolate into the ground, so it helps the groundwater as well. And what happened is you first saw this down in Southern California, where folks were pumping groundwater. This was before we had built our projects in California. And there was a lot of push to build a Colorado River project to bring some of the Colorado River water over to Southern California, again, storing some of that water in reservoirs and then transporting it down to some of the municipalities down in Southern California. But then all the agriculture in the Central Valley that was booming then was relying on groundwater, but the agricultural folks could see that a lot of the aquifers were being depleted, and they were quite concerned. So there was a big push to really draw on some of that northern water that could be captured in the reservoirs and then transported to the south. And that became our Central Valley project. And yet, we were still a very thirsty state. That water really just went to agriculture, and it didn't go over the Tehachapi Mountains. It was just north of the Tehachapis. And so the folks in Los Angeles and a lot of the agricultural areas further south, they were getting some Colorado River water, but it wasn't enough. And so the state then built the State Water Project. The Central Valley Project ended up being a federal project. Interestingly enough, it didn't start out that way, but the state didn't have the money to construct it. But the State Water Project was built by California, and that actually brought the water over the Tehachapis Mountains and into Southern California to many of the municipalities and some of the agriculture that's still down there. So we have a system in California now that basically moves water around in multiple ways. Some of the State Water Project water does go to coastal areas, not quite as much. It's mostly really feeds Southern California. And if you look at what those areas are using as their water, it's a very high percent of it is that imported water, because a lot of the groundwater basins have been overpumped. So a lot of reliance on that. There's a big push now to try to go to recycled water and to desalination water. The push is always, where can we get more water?
Right.
And, there's a real reluctance to cut back. And recycled water, you see in a lot of the agencies, their future plans are mainly to build and expand on recycled plants. And the interesting thing about recycled water is that, in a sense, it's not really the solution to drought, because it relies a lot on capturing wastewater and recycling it, and there's usually less of that during the drought. So then you're going to get less recycled, an ability to get less recycled water. And then desalination is another area, especially for the coastal regions. And many of those are not hooked up to the State Water Project, although some are, but many are not. And the desalination also has issues with that are environmental and that are involve cost, and also who constructs it, whether it's big private companies that are constructing it, and that also raises concerns about future costs and access. So California definitely has a lot of thinking to do about its future water supplies.
Ruth, we seem to be having droughts much more frequently than when I moved to California 40 years ago. I wonder if you could talk about the likely impacts of climate change on water availability in the state.
Right. Okay, so climate change is, we're projecting that there are going to be increased wet periods and dry periods, so more severe and intense droughts, and also more severe and intense winter storms. So in terms of drought, it's going to mean that the State Water Project and the Central Valley Water Project, that comes a lot from snowmelt. There'll be less snow. So there's going to just be less water imported down to Southern California, to many of the agricultural districts, and to some of the coastal areas as well. Let's see. In terms of temperatures, that will also create some issues in terms of soil moisture. And then even in terms of capturing the water in the reservoirs, because we're getting these storms that are more extreme, we haven't really figured out yet the best way to capture that water sufficiently. So all of that's going to mean less water all around in the state. And that's going to have some significant impacts, I think, on how we then move forward.
Agricultural users consume about 70 to 80% of the state's water, and they make only a very small contribution to the overall economy of the state. So is agriculture the most beneficial use for what is increasingly scarce water?
Well, I don't think it's really so much an agriculture versus municipality issue for a number of reasons. First of all, we all want food, and so it's, I think, more a question of what kind of agriculture and how it's grown, and where it's grown. Because the fact is that you can also have an issue with urban areas, and I'll give you a really good example of that. If you take the Mojave area, it was primarily agricultural rangeland, that type of development there. And then when the highway came in from Los Angeles, you started to see a lot of the ag people either selling or leasing their rights to developers. And so the western part of that area started to develop like crazy. It was a little bit like Los Angeles almost a century ago. So it would go, one of the cities, for example, or that little region area that's the closest to LA went from something like 50,000 to 450,000 people in a short time. And this really holds actually for Los Angeles as well, because when you have a drought, you can fallow your agricultural land, but you can't really fallow a city once it's built. So it just raises other kinds of issues, and I think it's more an issue of what kind of agriculture do we have, what kind of development do we put in, where do we put it, when we put it in, are we putting in permeable pavements, for example, so we're not completely eliminating the fact that groundwater will be replenished when it, even when it does rain. So sometimes I think there's a little bit of a false dichotomy between, should we just let agriculture be reduced and only, build more urban areas. I think it's just more complicated and complex than that, which is not to say that agriculture has a lot of should be really thinking about what it's growing, where it's growing, and how it's using the water. Mm-hmm. But that should probably be true for cities as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we shift to your research focus on groundwater? Why don't you tell us about California groundwater?
Hello?
Christine?
Is there another question?
Yes. Can you tell us about California groundwater?
Sure. Well, I personally think that that groundwater is the key resource in California. And as I'd mentioned, for a very long time, people could just pump groundwater with no real restrictions. And you just needed a well on your property. And the thing about groundwater was, therefore, it was cheap, and it could be accessed during every season and during a drought. So it was really an ideal source of water. And then what happened is we started to see impacts from all that pumping, so that you started to see these groundwater basins or aquifers starting to lose their storage. You saw wells going dry. Along the coast, you saw from the pumping the salt water kind of moving inland, what we call saltwater intrusion. When the aquifers were pumped, they sometimes collapsed, and we had subsidence happening in the land. So there have been a lot of problems with how we were managing our groundwater, although it is such a significant resource. I had made a note that I probably should also mention that groundwater is basically the water that's underground in the kind of nooks and crannies of the soil, so to speak, in a very general way. And there are just some specific rules for what the state considers groundwater versus surface water, because the state can regulate surface water. You have to get a permit, and it can't regulate groundwater. So there's been a certain amount of litigation over that to determine what is groundwater versus what is surface water. And the other interesting thing, of course, is that way back when all these legal rules came in, we didn't really understand the connection between surface water and groundwater, which we do much more now. And so that has come into play in terms of the water board being able to step in certain instances to say that, well, you're pumping groundwater right near this river, which means you're actually depleting the surface water in the river, so you can't really do that.
Okay, yeah, go ahead and continue with your discussion of groundwater.
Okay, so it's an easy water supply source. In fact, even when imported water started going down to Southern California, that cost money, and folks still pumped groundwater because it was the cheapest, easiest way to do to get their water. But it's not just individual wells. Groups of urban areas and groups of farmers got together to form various local agencies and districts to help kind of pulled together their groundwater supplies, and they basically sort of manage groundwater, but with very limited rules for withdrawals or for any kind of sustainability actions. These actually, there were kind of a diverse group of entities that managed that groundwater. You had local agencies and districts of all different kinds. They were pretty diverse. Of all the, and that was the bulk of how water was managed kind of around the state. 15 of these districts were designated as something called Special Act District, and I'm mentioning those because we ended up doing 2 reports for the Water Board that really were wonderful opportunities to understand more about groundwater in the state. And these special districts, these Special Act Districts, had slightly enhanced ability to manage their basin. They were created by an act in the legislature that gave them certain stronger authority. You also had some city and county ordinances that were passed to try to, manage groundwater in some kind of more sustainable fashion. And then you also had something called adjudication, where groundwater users, and they were generally the municipalities down, for example, in the West Basin, though, in Southern California, right on the coast there, there were also the oil companies that were using water. And these folks went, these institutions or entities went to court to establish their water rights as a way of figuring out. First of all, they wanted to make sure that in some instances they had the authority to get the imported water, but they also wanted to figure out who was going to have to pay for aspects of the management. So, for example, as one interesting example, if you take the San Gabriel River in Southern California, sort of the upper river folks who didn't really see many problems, or some of those folks didn't see many problems with their groundwater because they were the first to receive some of the replenishment. They didn't necessarily want to pay for imported water. They just kept pumping, whereas the folks further westward, they were getting saltwater intrusion from all their pumping, and so they absolutely had to get imported water. And so there were some conflicts, and the folks went to court to figure out who were going to pay for, to resolve some of these conflicts and to fix the problems that were there, such as saltwater intrusion or basically depleted, and that's called adjudication. And so they go to court, and they have a water master that's appointed by the court, and that is definitely how those basins are managed. And that's important because if you look at Southern California, that place where you have those huge metropolises, most of those basins are adjudicated. Most of those urban areas are adjudicated. The whole San Gabriel River, most of those basins, the Santa Ana River, most of those basins, Mojave is adjudicated, and so on. And the adjudication really wasn't necessarily about managing the basin sustainably. It was more about figuring out who has what water rights, so that who can figure out who pays for what in terms of the water management. So there was this diverse group of institutions all around the state, as well as a lot of just individual pumpers that were pumping groundwater. And interesting enough, in the adjudication, all those lots and lots of individual pumpers that didn't pump very much, they were usually just excluded, and they weren't considered as part of the adjudication. And it wasn't really the court that made the decision in so many of those basins. The big users got together, and it was the major users got together and figured out how they wanted to do this, and then they presented it to the court. The court generally said okay, or maybe made some modifications. So that's how it was initially managed, and not very well, because we kept having more and more problems. Yeah.
So, I mean,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it sounds as though much more water has been allocated in theory than is available. I mean, is it? To some extent, you would say that all the surface water,
you would say that almost all of that has been over allocated. And remember, with groundwater, it wasn't exactly a matter of allocation because there weren't set amounts. You know, you could just pump so long as supposedly your use was reasonable and beneficial. And no one's really, there have been very minimal legal challenges to this notion of reasonable and beneficial. Some of the law folks say, you know, that's another doctrine coming down the road that might be used. But in a sense, that was, you know, what happened was the next step was that you had all these problems with groundwater. People realized how important groundwater was. And when I was teaching, I used to show my class, this was like pre-2014, I used to show all the books and the articles that were written saying, help, we've got to do something about our groundwater because it's being depleted, and this is water that we are really going to need during a drought, you know, if we have a really big one, and yet it's not going to be available. But there was tremendous resistance locally to having the state step in any way, and I always joke that that one of the important people in water in California, you know, used to announce at all these conferences I would go to that over my dead body, will the state ever step in and do anything with groundwater? But then we had this great big drought in 2012 to 2016, and that was sort of the final push, and the state did indeed step in and passed its first groundwater management act called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So it's changed the landscape for California. I would say significantly, although we'll see how it plays out in the long term.
In legal terms, I was going to ask you about this act. Does it put groundwater regulation under the state? I mean, does the state become responsible for that, or is it still assume a certain amount of, you know, political back and forth and negotiation?
This is how I would describe it. It basically provides a set of unifying standards to try to deal with, you know, overdrafted basins. But the technical interpretation and how these standards are implemented is left up to the state. And it's kind of similar to the Clean Water Act, which we have on a federal level, which is the federal government sets certain standards, but the states are the ones that are responsible for implementing those standards. And the same is true for SGMA, which is that the state is setting certain standards, and locally you can implement those standards any way you want, so long as you meet some of those standards. And it was tricky. I mean, I wondered, I was part of the process a little bit when those negotiations were going on, and I found myself wondering exactly how they would tackle something like this because conditions are different all over the state in terms of groundwater. To some extent, it is a local resource with, you know, different constraints and issues in different places. And they did what I thought was one of the most intelligent things, which is most basins manage because they're having a problem, and these are what you might think of as undesirable results. So the state stepped in and said, well, guess what? There are certain undesirable results that you have to manage so that you make sure that you don't have those undesirable results. And they listed them. So you can't have persistent lowering of groundwater levels. You can't have a reduction in the groundwater storage. You can't have saltwater intrusion. You can't have degradation of water quality. You can't have major land subsidence. And you can't have major water depletion. So from 2014 on, you have to start managing so these things do not continue. So the drawback is it's from 2014 on. So everything you did before that is not considered. So you could have really overdrafted your basin, and you don't have any responsibility to replenish it. All you have to do is make sure that it doesn't get further overdrafted going into the future. Same with saltwater intrusion. You might have quite a bit of saltwater intrusion. What you mainly have to do is show that the rate is flowing and you aren't going to have any, you know, over time it's going to basically stop. And the state then what happened is that under the act to actually do this, the state basically designated what they called high and medium priority basins. And these were basins that were designated with using a number of different criteria, but primarily these were basins that had some chronic overdraft. And these basins had to form what are called local groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs, and they had to produce groundwater sustainability plans, or GSPs. And the GSPs were to say how they were going to bring the basin into sustainability. And that's what's going on now. Some of those have been actually submitted to the state, and the state's reviewing them. And they have the ability to step in if they don't feel the criteria are being met to reduce these undesirable results. And so people are waiting to see what the state is going to do. There's another interesting thing to note, which is that adjudicated basins do not come under the Act. Remember, adjudicated basins cover a lot of territory down in Southern California. And basically, they're encouraged to comply with SGMA, but it's a very voluntary thing. And some of the early research that we're looking at is showing that, it's mixed. Some basins are definitely moving in that direction, but other basins are not. Or I should say other adjudicated areas are not. So in a sense, it's trying to incentivize local groups, local institutions to really improve their groundwater management by avoiding or reducing these undesirable results as they move forward. And we've looked at a bunch of the plans as well, and again, sort of a mixed story in terms of the biggest push is to increase supply, and those are all over the place. There's one basin who wants to do cloud seeding, and there's a lot of recycled water and so on. Those basins do not want to reduce demand. Our culture does not necessarily really want to fallow areas.
This is Ronnie Lipschitz. My guest today on Sustainability Now is Dr. Ruth Langridge, who studies groundwater in California. And we've been talking about the sort of latest efforts to manage groundwater through the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And I made the comment after Ruth described all of this to me that it sounds like a real mess. And Ruth is going to tell us why it isn't a mess.
Well, it's not a mess because I have seen, the way historically this has evolved over, since 2003, so a good, almost 20 years. And I would say that definitely you see all those entities that are trying to manage groundwater working to try to deal with the problems that had been there, such as reduction in storage, lowering of levels, saltwater intrusion. So there's a real effort to think about this and to try to come up with ways that they can reduce these undesirable effects. There's also been a push to make the process more participatory, and again, it's had a mixed result, but in general, there was nothing like that prior to SGMA. I mean, it was, basically a pretty insular process in terms of who were the decision makers managing water, and at least there is a push now to do this. And again, the jury isn't out, I think, in terms of how successful has all this been, but it's definitely an improvement in terms of how people are thinking about managing groundwater and what they're at least making some attempts to do. I think the real weaknesses are that it didn't address anything prior to 2014, so that is a problem. I definitely think that more needs to be done with adjudicated basins, sort of moving in that direction, and as I say, some are. But it would be nice to feel that there was something a little more concrete there in terms of how those basins are thinking about this. And so I think although it's mixed, I think the jury is out until we see also what the state does, what it says in terms of these management plans, and whether it comes back and says, okay, this plan has some issues, and we'd like you to try to address these in a stronger way, and it will be interesting to see.
It will. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I wonder if you might tell us about your current research.
Right. Well, I'm pretty excited about what we're doing right now. I have two major projects, and one is thinking about groundwater, and actually it came out of something I did with the adjudicated basins, where a very, very early adjudication that normally is not even referred to, they had a ruling about what kind of crops you could grow and where and when, and I thought, wow, that would be hard to pass up now, and I had received some interesting work on some modeling that was done on land use and water, and so applied for a grant with the person who had done this land use and water modeling, and we looked at, along the California coast, the intersection of land use and water supply. It was a modeling that used a scenario analysis approach, and with involvement of all the local stakeholders in the regions. We had a bunch of meetings. We got what their goals were and their priorities. We translated that into policies, and then we could model the trade-offs between these different policies. One of the things that happened is that we were focusing, one of the areas, partners that we had was the city of Salinas, which is a disadvantaged community. And we realized that land and water people, in this case, were not necessarily on the same, they were sort of thinking in parallel directions but not connecting. And Salinas was really interested in housing. And so we've now got a second grant where we're actually incorporating the trade-offs, including the housing issues. We have someone coming in that's also looking at the carbon impact of some of these policies. So again, it's a scenario approach with different stakeholders where we get their goals, we translate that into policies, and we look at the trade-offs. And then I have a second project with Chris Ansell, who is the professor, he's actually chair of political science at Berkeley. He was on my dissertation committee, and he's an institution person, and actually that is a really major interest of mine. And we're looking at what characteristics of groundwater institutions are most likely to result in more sustainable resource outcomes. We have started doing a comparison of adjudicated basins and special ed districts. We're kind of it's a little more theoretical, actually, in a way, but grounded in everything that I already know about all these basins. We were able to build some theory, and we had a lovely little grant from NSF that's enabling us to kind of lay the groundwork for some additional projects that we're hoping to pursue. So, yeah, two pretty exciting projects right now.
Okay. Well, listen, we're just about out of time. Is there anything else that you might want to tell us?
I would love to see a way of getting the general public more familiar with water in California, because we make, decisions when we vote. And it's a complicated story, water in California. It's not really simplistic, and it just seems like it would be so great if there was a little more knowledge out there so people could make really informed decisions. That's always the thing that's in the back of my head. I would love to see that. When I was teaching the California Water Law and Policy class, I would come in and say, okay, this is a class where you probably know absolutely or very, very little, and you are going to come out knowing an awful lot about this resource that's so important. And I would like to see that across the whole field.
So I'd venture to say that's the case for many of the resources that we deal with and that are facing all kinds of problems. How do you get the public more engaged? It's a real challenge. Well, listen, Ruth. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, that's it.
Okay. Yeah. No, we're out of time, and so I want to thank you so much for being my guest on Sustainability Now.
You're most welcome. It was a pleasure. Nice to chat with you.
Yeah. I hope we
talk
can
a lot, and we don't do that as much anymore these days. So,
yeah. I hope we can catch up at some point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
All right. So in 2 weeks, my guests on Sustainability Now will be Brooke Wright and Joe Fleming. They are associated with the California Green Business Network, which works with small to medium-sized businesses to foster a vibrant and healthy green economy. Led by a coalition of cities and counties, GBN contributes to more livable communities with healthier environments while conserving resources and saving money. So that's on Sustainability Now, Sunday, March 21st, 2021, from 5 to 6, right here on KSQD 90.7 FM and ksqd.org, streaming on the internet. And as a reminder to you early risers, shows from this 5 to 6 p.m. Sunday slot are rebroadcast the following Tuesday mornings from 6 to 7 a.m. And if you'd like to listen to previous shows on Sustainability Now, you can find them at ksqd.org/Sustainability Now, as well as Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Pocket Casts. I want to thank everybody for listening, and especially thanks to Christine Barrington for today's engineering and meeting all of those technical challenges that we were facing. And I want to thank all the staff and volunteers who make K-Squid your community radio station. So until next every other Sunday, Sustainability Now.
Desiccated grama grass wilting on the ground. Crisp yellow leaves are falling all around. A west wind blows with cruel might, and the prairie fires burn all through the night. We need rain. We need rain. Not a cloud in the sky, in the pale blue sky. If we don't get a rain, everything's gonna die.